Mark a heart attack on Tuesday morning, because he in our other online Bible study, he reminded me that I was speaking tonight, and I was adamant that I'd said all I needed to say the last time, until he reminded me, or he showed me the text that we had swapped back and forwards when we were deciding to split this talk up. So once we got that sorted out, then Mark was calmed down. I wasn't, because I suddenly realized I had a lot of work to do to try and cut down the amount of material in the study for tonight. And I've done my best, but I'll be honest with you and say there's quite a lot of work to get through. So I trust that you're wide awake and not nodding off after a heavy meal or too much wine or whatever. A recap is difficult. We're looking at Romans chapter 14, verses 1 to 12, if you've got a Bible. Romans chapter 14, 1 to 12. And we looked at verses 1 to 4 last time, a month ago, which, you know, Paul is trying to answer questions and areas of debate that were going on between the Jewish and Gentile believers in the congregation in Rome at the time of his writing. And there's lots of detail in there, and it's too much to go into at this point. But last time we were dealing with the whole issue, or he was dealing with the whole issue of food. What was acceptable food? What was acceptable to the Gentiles? What was acceptable to the Jewish believers in Messiah? What was maybe even acceptable to not yet Jewish believers in Messiah, who were still coming along to the congregation in the city of Rome? So we looked at verses 1 to 4. This time we're going to try and look at verses 5 to 12. And again, we're dealing with actually what is a controversial subject when it comes to the church, in inverted commas, and its attitude to certain things going back over the centuries. So Paul writes in Romans 14, verse 5, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us live to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Messiah died and lived again, that he might be both Lord of the dead and of the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. So as I said the last time, as we approach these few verses from Romans 14, let's first remember that the letter to the Romans that Paul wrote was to believers in Yeshua, and it comes from Paul, who was a thoroughly Jewish apostle who has totally embraced Messiah Yeshua as his Messiah. And he was also an apostle who at the same time had not in any way turned his back on Judaism and the Hebrew scriptures, because that's what he taught from, as well as the accumulated stories and teachings of Yeshua. The two were combined in Paul's ministry. So we need to hold that understanding that this is the background of this traveling itinerant preacher-teacher. We need to keep that in our minds constantly so that we do not misinterpret what Paul is writing and impose on our 21st century Western theologies on the text of this teaching letter. So he says in verses 5 and 6 of Romans 14, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. Now, some at once asked the question, what is the connection between Paul's previous discussion that we looked at last month, that is probably available somewhere on the internet, about eating and not eating certain foods, and then this topic of days set aside in some special way. So, that's the obvious question that flows out of the text. How are these two things related? And looking back over the history of Christian interpretation of Romans 14, 5, and 6, there are three general ways that these verses have been understood. These days, in inverted commas, refer to 1, days of fasting, 2, ceremonial days in the Jewish year, including the weekly Shabbat, the weekly Sabbath, or 3, distinguishing between, in inverted commas, lucky and unlucky days upon which certain events should be held. So that's the possibilities in general in the way that this has been looked at by Christian interpreters. Now, knowing and understanding Paul, as we hopefully do, it is taken as certain that he was definitely not giving any credence to the superstitious nonsense covered by the third option of lucky and unlucky days, which sadly still exists both inside and outside of some sections of Judaism right to this very day. So setting number 3 aside, the other two possibilities have been the ones maintained throughout the history of the Christian church. So the first option, relating to days of fasting, is the one held by the ancient fathers of the church and is still maintained by some Christian commentators. However, the majority of Christian commentators, no surprise here, predictably understand Paul to be writing about the change from Shabbat or the Sabbath to the Lord's Day or to Sunday. So first then, to summarize the second position in relation to Sunday, and those who take the view that the Sabbath has been changed from the 7th day of the week to the 1st day of the week. Generally speaking, those who hold to this understanding do so on the basis that the new covenant in their thinking replaced what they called the old covenant. So where the old covenant set aside the 7th day as the Sabbath, the new covenant initiated the 1st day of the week as the Lord's Day, because it was on the 1st day of the week that Yeshua rose from the dead. However, there is just one little problem here in the text that seems to blow that idea out of the water. Rather than considering one day as preferred to another on theological grounds, the point Paul is making is both the one who chooses a specific day as well as the one who chooses no day are both fine with their decisions. Neither position is right or wrong. From Paul's perspective, both are equally acceptable. This means that the one who held a specific day to be the right day and the only right day was just as correct as the one who held that there were no special days for meeting. If indeed Paul was referring to those who maintained the weekly Sabbath in contrast to those who had abandoned the special nature of any day, then the church should agree and allow both as well. For Paul makes it very clear that both views are acceptable. But this has not been the case throughout the history of the church. Not only were those who remained Sabbath keepers marginalized, they were persecuted for holding the 7th day as distinct from the 6 days of work. So bearing in mind who it is who is actually writing this letter and the time at which he is writing it, before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, when it comes to the whole contentious debate of Shabbat and Sunday, we have to take on board the following. There is no historical or documented foundational teaching prior to the destruction of the Second Temple by any of the church leaders that supports in any way the change from Shabbat to Sunday. There is nothing in the writings of the early church leaders to support such a change. Nothing. Secondly, there are only 2 times in the whole of the apostolic writings in other words, what we call the New Testament, were even mention of the first day of the week in connection to the sect of Judaism called at the time the Way. And that's, I'm not going to look at it now, but Acts 20, verse 7, and 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. Those are the only two places where that's mentioned. Thirdly, looking closely at these two scriptures in their context, it is clear that Acts 20, verse 7 is talking about the conclusion of the Sabbath. When Paul began to teach after the conclusion of the Sabbath, after what is called Havdalah ceremony that closes the Sabbath and welcomes the new day and the new week. It is reasonable to assume that Roman slaves were not allowed the Sabbath as a day of rest by their masters. So the only time they could gather with Jewish believers was after the day's work was completed. In Acts 20, Paul anticipated traveling the next day and prolongs his time with the believers into the late evening and on into the night. Since the new day begins at sunset from a Jewish reckoning, the Havdalah service was technically on the first day of the week. Therefore, it seems quite possible that the Jewish believers and their non-Jewish believing brethren would eat together at the end of the Sabbath, sharing with those who, because of their slave status, could not attend the Sabbath services. Added to that, this is hardly presented by Luke in the Acts of Records as a substitution for the Sabbath. Fourthly, if you turn to 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2, this deals with Paul's strong challenge that those communities which were part of the Way, as it's called in Acts, should gather money for the relief of those in great need in Jerusalem. Since it is traditional Jewish halakha, the way to live, that money is not gathered on the Sabbath, it was only natural that another day should be chosen for this purpose. Therefore, to select the first day of the week makes sense, since the awareness of the needs was no doubt made known in the Sabbath gatherings, and they would be fresh in the minds of the community in Corinth. Note carefully that in the context of 1 Corinthians 16, there is no clear mention that the community gathered together in order to bring together these funds. All the text really indicates is that individually each should set aside money on the first day to await its gathering when Paul actually arrived among them. Number 5, looking to the existing historical records and documentation available to us from the times of what we call the Church Fathers, there was a clear and identifiable shift in the 2nd century away from the Sabbath to the first day of the week. However, there were still many who considered the Sabbath to be a day of rest and a day that the followers of Yeshua should observe. Despite church laws banning keeping the Sabbath and other Jewish festivals, believers in Yeshua were keeping them despite persecution and excommunication until as late as the 4th century. So taking all of this together, there is no justification for the later anti-Judaism rules and regulations and all that went with that down through the Middle Ages and up to today. There is no reason to read all of that back into Paul's time. So when he was writing about days and one observing one day over another, he cannot be referring to the much, much later Sabbath Sunday debate. It did not exist at the time that Paul was writing to the Romans. So all of this then begs the question, what was Paul writing about at this point in his letter? And in the light of what was going on in the strands of Judaism that existed in Paul's day, there are at least two possibilities. Judaism was not one big sort of homogeneous group. There were all sorts of groupings and sects within the Judaisms of Paul's day. So looking at how they were doing things, there are two possibilities. The setting of the date of the festival of Shavuot or Pentecost is known to have been controversial in the 1st century AD. At least 3 different groups within Judaism, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essene community at Qumran, calculated the date of the festival differently. Did you know that in Jesus' day, there were different Jewish calendars in circulation? Different groups held different festivals on different days of the week or different days in the year. They may have been close to each other, but they were not all on the same day. Secondly, the other possibility, Paul may be writing about scheduled fast days. Again, from documentation of the time, the matter of fasting was an important one in the 1st century, and that controversies even continued into the 2nd and 3rd centuries among Christian church leaders regarding the proper days of fasting. In relation to the first possibility and the contention over how the date of Shavuot was set, in the overall scheme of things, it's not that vital to go into all the details as to why these 3 major groups within Judaism could not agree. It all basically revolves around what constituted certain Sabbaths within the festival of Passover and then the counting of the 50 days to Shavuot from a specific Sabbath. The point is that with something as important as the Jewish calendar as one of the 3 Torah-commanded festivals, and certainly not ignoring what happened at Shavuot festival after Yeshua's ascension, it would be totally, and I mean totally, out of character for the Paul that we know not to spell out his views on such an important matter. For Paul, this would definitely not have been, I don't know, and nor both sides are right situation, because that's the way he's approaching the debate, the previous debate and this debate. He's not laying down the law, and pardon the expression. He's not coming down on one side or the other. He's leaving it open to people's choice. So that leaves us with the distinct possibility that Paul is addressing an area of tension within the faith community in Rome about the subject of fast days. This whole section from verse 5 to 12 is more than likely about days of fasting. In what is known as the intertestamental period, in Judaism, there came an increased emphasis on fasting. Several of the apocryphal books which appeared in this period commended the practice. When it comes to the apostolic writings, there is also a growing emphasis on the practice. And there are multiple references in the Gospels that Yeshua makes to the whole issue of fasting, because it was part and parcel of Jewish religious life of the day. And it also seems that early communities of the way practice fasting. Acts 13, verse 2, Acts 14, verse 23. In the teaching of the rabbis, Mondays and Thursdays were the prescribed days for fasting. But they also forbade fasting on Sabbaths and festival days, because these were days of rejoicing, and you don't fast on a day of rejoicing. Taking all of this into account, by the time that Gentiles were in a majority in the Christian church, it seems likely that the only 2 days left for fasting were Wednesday and Friday, something that was recommended in a collection of writings called the Didache, which is like an early discipleship manual for the early believers in Yeshua. Didache 8 verse 1 speaks to this. So it may well be possible that there were some tensions again between the Jewish believers in Yeshua, as well as the not yet Jewish believers who wanted fasting on certain days of the week as laid down by the Jewish sages and scholars of the day, whereas the Gentile believers wanted fasting on other days. Hence the need Paul feels to address the question of days here in the text. But since neither the Torah nor Yeshua had established specific weekly fast days, this issue too was in the end a matter of personal choice. And Paul is clearly not willing to establish a specific halakha, a specific Jewish ruling to cover it. In fact, when you look at the wording in verse 6, it actually fits well with the idea of the one who fasts in contrast to the one who does not. The one who eats gives thanks to the Lord, and the one who does not eat fasts unto the Lord. This combining of eating and days fits the scenario of scheduled fast days and best explains why Paul would begin with issues of eating and then move on easily to matters relating to days for fasting. And then verses 7 to 9, Paul says, "For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Messiah died and lived again, so that he might be Lord both of the dead and the living." These three verses need to be taken together as one continuous line of reasoning that Paul now includes to support the conclusion that he arrived at in verse 6. His point is, both in life and death, those who are true worshippers of God have their focus toward him. All matters of life, including facing death itself, has God as their focus. Why? Because such people belong to the Lord. Yeshua was the ultimate and perfect example of this attitude. In his life as well as his death, he lived and died unto God. In his death and resurrection, which cannot be separated, Jesus met the requirements to become the unquestioned Lord of all who are saved. He is the hope of those living as well as those who have died. For his death and resurrection, by his death and resurrection, all who are his will live again. It is therefore this focus upon Yeshua himself that can bring divergent and potentially divisive opinions into the realm of loving mutual submission within the body of Messiah. And then verse 10, where he asks the questions, why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. Paul now goes back to the theme he was pursuing in verse 3 of this chapter. Let not one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. His pointed questions are to both the weak and to the strong in faith. He's saying, how can you judge one another? Paul describes what he means by judge with the further question of despising a fellow member of the community or holding them in contempt. This is the same word that he uses in verse 3. So the judging that Paul is strongly challenging is not scrutinizing another's behavior against the standards of the Torah, but the kind of despising of one another because one individual cannot agree with another person's personal opinions, as per Paul's opening comments in verse 1 of this chapter. Please also note that twice in verse 10, Paul uses the word brother, Greek, for adelphos, a word he has not used since Romans 12, verse 1. Paul recognizes that both the one weak in faith as well as the one strong in faith are still brothers in the Lord. They are both covenant members in the broadest sense. Even those who have not yet confessed Yeshua as the Messiah, but who are nonetheless covenant members in the covenant of Israel, are referred to as brothers. Such a recognition will probably upset the theologians who think it is necessary to define brother on strictly theological grounds. But Paul once again displays his awareness of the covenant which functions on two levels, this world and the world to come. The covenant is real and viable in this world, but it also applies to the world to come. Submission to the Torah no doubt allowed for a place in the visible community of Israel, whether for the native born or for the non-Jew who attached himself to the community of Israel. However, the eternal aspects of the covenant, in other words, the world to come, required faith in Yeshua, a circumcision of the heart, as Paul talks about. Yet both these layers can be identified in Paul's understanding as brothers. Having said all that, the reality is, from Paul's perspective, that all will stand before the Lord as before a judge. This statement needs a little teasing out at this point. The phrase judgment seat of God or judgment seat of Messiah only appears here in Romans 14 and in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 10. However, the phrase judgment seat is more common. You'll find it in Matthew, John, and several places in Acts. In each of these cases, and including Romans and Corinthians, the Greek word is bema, and it had evolved in Paul's day to mean judicial bench, place of judgment, in other words, a court. The question of when the judgment seat of God or the judgment seat of Messiah will take place, like other hot topics, has been a matter of intense discussion among believers for a long, long time, and it probably will be until we all stand in that place. The mention of the great white throne in Revelation 20, verse 11, has often been claimed to be different from the judgment seat of Messiah mentioned by Paul. However, it is not clear that a difference can be made between these two supposedly separate events. Some theologians and commentators say the great white throne judgment is for unbelievers, while the judgment seat of Messiah is directed toward believers. But Acts 17, verses 30 and 31, does not differentiate nor envision two judgments. And even closer to what Paul writes in Romans 14, verse 10, is Acts 10, verse 42. At the end of the age, Yeshua will sit as judge upon his throne and judge the nations, separating the sheep from the goats. At that time, the wicked will be finally dealt with, while the righteous will be rewarded. Surely this corresponds to what John sees at the time of the great white throne, because the description is very similar. Of course, there appears to be a contradiction here, because Paul makes it clear that for those who are in Yeshua, all judgment has ceased. Salvation assures them that the wrath of God is past, and that no one will be able to bring a charge or accusation against God's elect. So does this mean that all mention of judgment in the apostolic writings is then pointed towards only unbelievers? Are those who are in Yeshua to give no thought for a future day in which their works will be judged? No. Paul calls his readers to pay attention to this kind of judgment, a judgment that assesses whether or not their and our lives, as those born again by the Spirit, have produced the fruit of genuine repentance and faith and trust in Yeshua. This type of fruit is seen in someone's willingness to maintain the standards of righteousness given to us by God and shown to us in the life and teachings of Yeshua, while at the same time not despising our brothers and sisters when they do not conform to our own personal opinions or standards. The motivation of the judgment seat of Messiah is therefore the deep desire to hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Such a motivation urged the child of God to an unceasing pursuit of God's truth and propels him or her forward in a desire to do good works. At the same time, it fosters patience, acceptance, and love towards those who, while maintaining an evident, obedient faithfulness to God, differ in matters that are based, again, on personal opinion. And then the last two verses in the passage, verses 11 and 12, "For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God." Having reminded his readers about the judgment seat of Messiah as a motivation to proper behavior within the community of faith, Paul, as he has done so many times in this letter, if you read it through and study it, he grounds his urging to live this way in a quote from the Hebrew scriptures, quoting Isaiah 45, verse 23. And Paul actually quotes from this same text in Philippians 2, verses 10 and 11, where he clearly implies what is being described to the exalted Messiah Yeshua. Whether or not Paul intends that his readers to see the fulfillment of Isaiah 45:23 in Yeshua as the final judge, it is clear that he intends to equate the judgment of God and that of Yeshua. Both the Father and the Son act together as the divine judge before whom all will bend the knee. However, in verse 12, the emphasis that Paul intends to give is that each one will give account of himself and not of his neighbor. The Greek text is emphatic. Each one of us, that is, each individual believer, will indeed give account. No one, but no one, will be exempt. No one will be able to answer for another, nor will anyone be in a position to judge another. Each will have his or her own reckoning before the just judge. If this is what happens in the final day, it should also be true now. We all stand before our own master, and to him we give account. For Paul, the end of days reality has a clear bearing upon the present. Since the future has invaded the present in the coming of Yeshua, we are to live in that reality. And in the present context, the emphasis Paul intends is how this impacts our response to others in the community, particularly when our opinions differ. There we have it, friends.
Thank you, Robin. That's fantastic. Questions, if you dare. If there's a question,
feel free to question because Piers is going to answer them.
Oh. Well, if there is a question, then
Richard's got his electronic hand up.
Fantastic.
Sorry, I attend a lot of these meetings, and there are these conventions. I think sometimes when we read the scriptures or when we think about this time, we are in the habit to Christianize that time. So we are thinking, and I think you brought this up, that it's not a singular. The Jewish people are not singular. I mean, only a few decades before, the Sadducees massacred the Pharisees. There was a whole lot of Pharisee rabbis were killed. I mean, they were not only diverse, they were also physically willing to rough it up.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things, I mean, I've been talking a lot with rabbis recently, and I've been challenging them and talking about it. And I think one of the things that sort of strikes me is Jewish people don't think of themselves necessarily as a religion. It's quite of a modern thing. It's part of the secular world, and it's part of being Christianized. Maimonides is kind of engaging Muslims and Christians, and he brings a little bit of that. But it's particularly in the last 250 years that Judaism has become, in the West, as Jews assimilated in the West, they preserve something which is called a religion. But so their thinking is that they are like a family. It's key. They're a people, and I've been challenging them. So what would I describe that? So one rabbi said, well, instead of thinking Judaism like Christianity, think of it like Hinduism. And that blows my mind, because we wouldn't want to go there normally. But Hinduism is actually the spiritual collective of a people. So if you think of a people in diversity, their spiritual collective, or their journey that they're spiritually on, is what is the Jewish people. And when we start to get that, then we start to understand these passages and Paul is taking it even further in diversity, because it was already Hellenized Jews, already divisive Jews and everything like that. He's taking it even further and saying the gospel can actually go to the Gentiles now. And I'm surprised, actually, I was looking up, trying to check your details, that Paul as a habit went to the synagogue. So it wasn't an issue.
Yeah.
He didn't get thrown out of the synagogue at that time. So and of course there was lots of converts at that time as well. So amazing diverse world that was going on. Paul is, I think you're right, talking about attitude, what it is to be in the Spirit of God and be connected with God. And therefore, we are very often wrong when we look at this passage, because we very often read it as if it's about religion and religious practices. And you picked up very much, particularly the religion of Christianity, when it starts to take off in the 3rd century, starts to become very anti-Jewish. And we have lots of evidence where the Orthodox Church accuses the Western Church of being Judaizers because they use unleavened bread for the communion and the little wafers that we sometimes see. So you can see they're attacking each other. Christian groups are attacking each other, whether they're Jewish or not. So we know that all the theology that forms on the basis of anti-Judaism. And so that's often inputted into that. Yeah, that's just a comment.
Yeah.
I don't know if you like thinking about
No, it's fine. Yeah.
Hinduism, but no, because we often think of that as pagans, but we forget how pagan we are. I mean, you did actually make some references to Neoplatonism. I know Augustine and all like that, but there is just we are mixed into paganism very much in our thinking. That we should be more humble in the West and recognize that we are not on the pedestal to judge the rest of the world. We're on a journey with the world, and particularly if we recognize that, the Jews will more easily come back rather than us thinking we are. Well, Paul says not to do that. Boasting yourself, you'll push everybody away.
I mean, I think the thing about the situation in Rome is that you've got at least 3 groups in this community of faith. You have definitely born again, as we would term it, Gentile believers who are, as Paul is taking them to task for looking down on the Jews, whether they were Jewish believers or not yet Jewish believers in Yeshua. It's not always clear. But you have the Jewish believers in Yeshua and possibly the not yet Jewish believers in Yeshua who are struggling with these Gentile converts. And Paul is doing his best to try and bring these 2, possibly 3 groups, these strands together, and get them to see that they need to respect each other, even though they are approaching things or looking at things through different sets of lenses. And so he's giving them the freedom. I mean, it's amazing. We think of Paul as a, ram slam legalist. You've got to do it this way, you've got to do it that way. But actually in this letter, he gives lots of leeway, because he's not saying, I'm right and you're wrong. There are certain ways of walking with the Lord where as long as it's not against the Torah, as long as it's not against the word of God, you have leeway to walk with the Lord in freedom. And he's trying to bring these groups together and get them to respect each other and not be judging one another, which is what 13 and 14 are all about. It's a really interesting situation, in some ways, not unlike some of the situations today where, as believers in Yeshua, we can be so divided, pardon the expression, over the piddliest little things. Sometimes over major things, yes, true, but often we divide over the minor things, which are periphery. They're not salvation issues. And I think that's how we bring it into, the 21st century. Don't do that. If it's not a salvation issue, you've got to learn to respect one another.
Amen.
Sergey, he's got his hand up. If you could unmute Sergey, that would be great.
Yes, Robin, thank you very much. Just a remark. I think Paul was very good disciple of Gamliel Ramban. and he learned a lot from his academy.
Yeah.
And the way he acts and the way he writes and his attitude toward those separate groups is typical a reflection of the, let's say, Talmudic or the practice of the sages of Mishnah time. Because in the Hellenistic way of thinking, to people that engage in dialogue can have different opinions, and those different opinions well estimated or accepted by each other side, you know. And we know this famous expression, there are two Jews, you know, and we say 7 opinions among them.
7, oh my goodness, all right.
Yeah, 7 is a number of perfection. And in this case, we teach and we see Paul being a very good disciple of his great teacher. And by the way, when we read and when we study the letter to Hebrews, I think the same idea is behind, you know, that the message the author is trying to bring to the separate groups, obviously the group of non-believing Jews, group of believing Jews, of course, and probably some other groups. And just a remark, and thank you again for very profound and very, very good Bible studies.
Thank you.
Robin, I have 2 questions for you.
Oh, right.
One is, if I understand you right, you're basically saying Romans 14 is about fasting and not about Sabbath. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So it's sort of a bit of a red herring to look at that verse 5 and say, oh, that's a comment on the Sabbath generally.
Yeah. It's nothing to do with it, because if you look at the context, he's talking about food or not eating food.
Yeah. It's all about food. And the other thing was in verse 5, it says some esteem, one person esteems one day above another esteems every day, and then alike is in italics because it doesn't appear in the Greek.
Yeah.
So does that mean that actually it flips the whole sentence round, whereas one esteems one particular day and someone else esteems all of the days?
I mean, that's the way it seems. It's interesting. You've got it in italics in yours, and I have not got it in italics in mine, which is supposed to be one of the more accurate translations. So there you are. Yeah. So I mean, I could pull that one apart a bit further, but there just wasn't time. I mean, something had to get cut out.
No, that's fine. Yeah. Great. Any other, and then we'll move on, because obviously lots been happening in Israel. And we're going to go. Yes, indeed. I've got that on my plate. So whilst you've been preparing, so have I tried to pull those strands together. But Mark, we've got some notices before then. Is that right? Thank you, Robin, as always. Fantastic. Thank you very much.